I was reading through a Washington Post op-ed on a story that broke just before the holiday weekend. National Department of Education testing now confirms that the academic performance of 3rd and 4th graders has dropped significantly after 2+ years of COVID-sabotaged classrooms, much of that no classroom at all, just a Zoom call Band-Aid we somehow expected to educate our children adequately, and are now supposed to be shocked that it didn't. In fact, academic performance for these kids is much worse than feared, the Post notes. In some areas, the biggest performance drops in the 50-year history of the testing, which had me thinking, we need to stop treating worse than feared as some sort of surprise in this context. That's why it's so important to keep chronicling all the different ways in which the deal that we were sold, or in many cases, the deal that we eagerly bought, was a complete fraud. In all the ways that we radically reshaped our society, is there even one outcome that was not worse than feared? We accepted that in exchange for submitting to government orders to keep us safe from the virus, the government would keep us economically afloat. It didn't. We lost hundreds of thousands of Main Street American small businesses. Labor force participation has yet to recover. American savings are now at their lowest levels in over a decade. And the checks that were supposed to carry us through these tough times have been dwarfed by the costs of the inflation they created. Inflation that at first wasn't happening at all, they said. Then it was transitory, so don't worry about it. Then it was good, actually. It was a sign of recovery. And then it was undeniably bad, but it was Putin and corporate greed's fault. And then finally, it's very bad, and yeah, it might kind of be their fault, but now we're going to spend our way out of the mess that their spending created in the first place. And remember, the original deal was just hang on until the vaccine is out, then everything will be fine. But that too has turned out much worse than feared. First, it was 95% effective and guaranteed to prevent transmission. So who in their right mind would ever refuse? And if you do refuse, well, you should be punished with banishment from your job and all the other perks of polite society. And then over time it became, whoops, turns out it doesn't do much at all for transmission. So, hey, sorry about your firing, I guess, but there's really nothing we can do about that now except complain about the worker shortage that this nonsense created. Who could have foreseen that booting people off the job would create poorer performance of the job, or in many cases, no performance at all, until the CDC's final form of this idiocy, new guidance that says there's really no sense in public policy that differentiates between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated at all. A tacit admission that all of those coercive differentiations of the last year plus were meaningless. Okay, but those are just economic and social consequences, and we had to pay them to save life itself. Did we, though? The evidence that this lockdown deal saved lives is next to none. There is, however, evidence to the contrary that it actually cost lives, particularly young lives, who saw the largest percentage increases in deaths above baseline in this entire event. At some point in the repetition, you have to start considering whether worse than feared is the design, not the defect, especially when they're telling you as much. This was sold as a deal to get back to normal. But now normal itself is off the table too.
People do talk about going back to normal, and I've heard Mr. Secretary say, normal wasn't working out so well for some people. And so the goal in my mind is not to go back to normal. The goal is to build a very different new normal that has equity much more at the heart of it.
This wasn't trading a little inconvenience for safety. This was trading a little inconvenience for a suicide attempt. It was lose-lose from the early days of March 2020 all the way through the dwindling nonsense that remains today. It was always all cost, no benefit, imposed for no necessity other than our own fear and the ridiculous belief that some central power will care for us better than we can care for ourselves. And now, to make it still worse than feared, it's not just that we couldn't stick up for ourselves. We couldn't stick up for our children either. We made their education and their futures collateral damage in this deal that was all damage already. I'd say we threw the kids under the bus, but of course there isn't anybody to drive that bus anyway. We fired the driver because he wouldn't get the vaccine. Just one of the many ways in which we have kept our children safe by stunting them and robbing them of their education. These newly released test results are part of what's called the National Report Card. It's an exam that's administered annually by the Department of Education to a sample of about 10,000 students nationally. There are 3 age groups that they measure, but the results in this case are for the 9-year-old group. The National Center for Education Statistics compiles and reports the results, and on Thursday, they release their findings. Reading and math scores declined during the COVID-19 pandemic, their headline reads. Comparing data from winter 2020, just before the viral spread, to winter 2022, early in the year this year, on a scale from 0 to 500, the average student score in reading declined 5 points. That's the largest drop in the test since 1990. The average math score dropped 7 points. That's not only the largest drop in the history of the test dating back to 1970, that's the only time that math scores have dropped. We heard the president's COVID advisor say earlier that this isn't just about safety, it's about building a more equitable future. Well, funny, just like their promises about virus safety and economic security fell well short, their efforts for equity had a similar reverse effect. Because as the report notes, the most drastic drops in performance were not among the highest scoring students, they were among the lowest scoring students. The bottom 10th percentile dropped significantly. The top 10th percentile dropped only minimally. The same trend is true in both reading and math. And of course, for the equity crowd, those performance percentiles do break meaningfully along racial lines. Overall, there was a 13-point drop in average scores for Black students in math, only a 5-point drop for white students, widening the equity gap, not alleviating it. In other words, this policy of locking down schools and replacing them with Zoom calls had the reverse effect that its equity architects otherwise talk about. It punished low-income, often racial minority students the most. It worsened the achievement gaps that they otherwise claim they'll eliminate. But of course, you'll notice the dishonest attempt to avoid responsibility for that outcome too. Notice the subtlety in the headlines. This was the result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the nation's report card, the reporting agency says. Likewise, the New York Times writes, it was the pandemic that erased 2 decades of progress in math and reading. No, it was not. It was our own policy prescriptions that moved kids out of the classroom and into a setting with little oversight and just a Zoom call on in the background. It was our own voluntary decision-making that did this, not some unavoidable pandemic necessity. Besides, if it was so obviously the pandemic that caused these poor outcomes, why do they waste time posing other, even more preposterous theories? As quoted by CNN, the commissioner of the agency administering the test says, hey, who knows? There are many factors at play that could explain this result, not just the pandemic. It could be school shootings. It could be cyberbullying. It could be teacher and staff vacancies. Well, yeah, but staff vacancies caused by what? Our own nonsensical mandates and obstructions to a normal classroom that we imposed voluntarily. Did the virus fire teachers for not getting vaccinated, or did we do that? And what's double dishonest about this agency commissioner posing these nonsensical explanations is that in the report, the agency actually refuses to consider any explanation at all. It says this report is not designed to identify the causes of performance differences, that there are many factors that influence student achievement, and they vary greatly across localities. And I'm sure that is broadly true in normal years, but this explanation ignores the obvious truth that these data are not from normal years. They're from years with a giant new variable introduced, removing kids from the classroom and putting them on Zoom calls instead. And we're just going to pretend maybe that might have had some impact, but who knows? It might have been all those school shootings at the schools that these kids were banned from attending. But of course, we don't have to rely on their silly analysis. The whole point of a data release is that we can do our own, or at least we should be able to, but this release doesn't make that as easy as it should be. Unsurprisingly, the variables of school shootings and cyberbullies aren't part of this dataset, but we know the variable that's the likely explainer is whether a student was subjected to remote learning or not. We know the agency tracked this variable because they say so. They know that 70% of the 9-year-olds they tested learned remotely during the 2020-2021 school year, and they know that higher performers among these remote learners had access to certain resources like a computer or a tablet, a quiet place to study, or an available teacher. Well, great. So we know which students learned remotely and which students didn't, and we know the test scores of these students. So this should be a very simple analysis. Did the test scores of the students who did not learn remotely suffer as greatly as the test scores of those who did? This report won't let you answer that question, because unless school shootings and cyberbullying have damaged my reading proficiency too, there is no way in this release to assess that information, even though they have that information. You can look at the charts that they give you, considering only the variables that they want considered, or you can cut the data according to your own variable selections, race, gender, school location, and more, but you cannot cut the data according to who was taught remotely and who was not. It's data that they have, but not data that they'll show. Actually, scratch that. It turns out my reading proficiency is damaged, or at least that they made the data less than obvious to find. But what else would you expect from a government website, I guess? After recording this video, I did find their survey data that differentiates between students saying they attended classes remotely and those saying they did not. And curiously, the results show an average score worse for those saying they had no remote learning than those who did have remote learning. Now, that could mean a few things. Perhaps remote learning isn't the primary force of damage that I thought it was, or perhaps this measurement just isn't precise enough. Note the question is just, did you ever attend class remotely? This variable is binary. It treats a student who attended classes remotely for a week the same as a student who had remote classes for a year. Whatever the case, it's clear that a combination of policy choices we made had a detrimental effect on student performance. When I first recorded this video, I next had a section speculating that this information was omitted with intent. It is not. It's just buried under a few rocks. But to the extent that the information isn't featured in the analysis, I still think it's fair to say there are some interests protecting the illusion that surrendering everything to central powers was beneficial, not incredibly foolish and damaging. And you can see that in the solutions that the media coverage proposes. This decline in test scores is, what else? Yet another emergency, which requires, what else? Ever more federal intervention. This is a crisis, says the woman who ran Chicago public schools through COVID, quoted in the New York Times piece about these test scores. Everybody should be treating this like the crisis that it is. So there's no time for questions about how it was the management of the last crisis that created this crisis, and why we should trust the people who botched the last crisis into a new crisis to fix anything ever again. It sounds more like they depend on crisis for a paycheck. And funny, that's exactly the solution that she's looking for, a bigger federal check. This is just like the Marshall Plan after World War II, she says. The Washington Post editorial board says there's no sense in looking back. All of that stuff is in the past. No value other than the lessons we could learn, never to do this nonsense again, of course, but while that may be valuable in terms of not throwing your kids under the bus, surely it's not as valuable as the billions of Fed bucks that we could try instead. That's how we're going to fix this, the Post board says. Congress has allocated $190 billion to schools to deal with the pandemic. Those funds should be spent with extra teaching in mind. Yeah, great plan. Focus on teaching and not any other extra nonsense. Maybe things would be better had we actually stuck to that. But if the billions in Corona Fed bucks we already sent weren't being spent on teaching, then what in the hell were they spent on? And what makes you so confident they'll be correctly spent this time? Notice the constant here. It's not their reasoning. It's not their advice or their mandates. Those things change every day. It's certainly not their successful management of the problem. The only constant is the flow of federal dollars to line the pockets of people who insist that they know how to manage everything about your life better than you do. They can't even manage their own wallets without stealing from yours. But a critical mass of us keep trusting them to do it. We've all heard the famous Franklin quote that those who sacrifice liberty for security receive and deserve neither. And doing so is certainly a moral failure, great enough, but apply that reasoning to our children, sacrificing them for just a little security. In that case, we've likely done something even more disgraceful. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below, and especially over on Minds, that is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chat in my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.